The night was dark, and the air was thick with the sound of 1,000 hearts pounding in unison. The crowd outside the studio was a seething mass of teenage energy, their voices blending into a single, deafening scream. They were there for one reason: Elvis Presley. The man who had single-handedly changed the face of music and the world of entertainment. But inside the studio, the scene was different. Bones Howe, the session producer, stood in the control room, surrounded by stacks of records that towered like skyscrapers. Each one was a potential hit, a song that could make or break a career. Elvis hadn't heard any of them before he walked into the studio. He arrived with his entourage, a group of loyal friends who dressed alike, in dark pants and loud sport shirts. Sometimes they even wore "I Like Elvis" buttons, turning the studio into a mini carnival. As the chaos outside reached a fever pitch, Bones took his place behind the console. His job was to play disc jockey, spinning these unheard records out into the studio where big speakers stood, ready to blast the music. The first record hit the turntable, and the room fell silent. Elvis and his friends stood in a tight circle, their eyes locked on the man who had become a legend. Elvis listened intently, his body swaying to the rhythm. After a few moments, he raised his hand, signaling to Bones. "Out," he mouthed, and the record was added to the reject pile. But when a song caught his ear, Elvis would tap the top of his head, a sign for Bones to play it again from the beginning. He'd listen 2 or 3 times, and if it was something he really wanted to record, they'd play it over and over until everyone knew it by heart. The sessions were intense, and Elvis's perfectionism was legendary. He might make 13 or 14 takes, going back to listen to the early ones, searching for that perfect moment. "I think we had one back there that was better," he'd say, and they'd rewind, play it again, and Elvis would dance, just like he did on stage. Every take was a performance, a piece of his soul laid bare. Steve Scholes, the head of RCA Victor, watched nervously from the control room. Elvis's habit of refusing to review material beforehand and insisting on working from head arrangements made him anxious, but the results were undeniable. By the end of the weekend, they had "Love Me," a song by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, and 3 songs by Little Richard, among others. It was a mix of rock, country, and everything in between, all filtered through the unique lens of Elvis Presley. But there was a problem. When Elvis danced, he moved with such intensity that he often stepped away from the microphone, making it hard to capture his voice. "Elvis, can't you stand still?" Scholes would ask, but Elvis would just shake his head. "I can't, I'm sorry. The music just moves me." To solve this, Elvis started thumping his guitar on the side or back on the afterbeat, a technique that was later added as an overdub, making it easier to record his voice. Bones Howe saw something in Elvis that no one else did. Elvis produced his own records, he said. He picked the songs, changed the arrangements, and made decisions on the spot. It was spontaneous, and it worked. He was the forerunner of modern record production. Everyone else just followed. Outside the studio, the world was changing. Elvis's music was a fusion of country and rhythm and blues, a sound that brought together 2 worlds that had been kept apart for too long. Country music purists didn't like it, but they couldn't deny its popularity. Record sales for Hank Snow and others plummeted, and the charts were soon dominated by a new breed of artists: Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, and more. Country radio stations switched to rock, and the youth market, once ignored, became a powerful force. Elvis's influence extended beyond music. Colonel announced a new and ambitious plan. He hired Howard Bell and Hank Saperstein to handle all of Elvis's product merchandising. Soon, there were 78 different Elvis Presley products on the market, from bobby socks to pajamas, each one a piece of the Elvis empire. The royalties poured in, and the Colonel and Elvis reaped the rewards, but the pressure was mounting. Elvis's mother, Gladys, was struggling with the fame. Her friend Faye Harris recalled how the fans would swarm their home, peeking through windows and tearing up the grass. She said, "Thank God, you're here to answer the doorbell." Gladys longed for a simpler life, hoping that Elvis would settle down, start a family, and retire. But the world of music and fame was a relentless machine, and it kept moving forward, driven by the king of rock and roll. Elvis's influence was everywhere, from the songs on the radio to the clothes on the shelves. The world was changing, and Elvis was at the center of it all. Elvis was back in his hometown of Tupelo for a grand homecoming that felt almost too perfect to be real. Elvis, the son of a poor sharecropper, had risen to fame and fortune, becoming a true American success story. The irony was that he was returning to perform at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show, the same place where he had sung Old Shep a decade earlier. The whole town of Tupelo was buzzing with excitement. September 26th was officially declared Elvis Presley Day, and a big banner was hung across Main Street. Shop owners decorated their windows with themes inspired by Elvis's songs. A parade was planned, and the city was ready to welcome their famous son home. Mayor Jim Ballard, who had known the Presleys when they lived in Tupelo, presented Elvis with a giant guitar-shaped key to the city. "This town's proud to call you its son," he said. The governor of Mississippi, James P. Coleman, even came to the event to show his support. The crowd was massive, with thousands of fans coming from all over the country. Buses filled with fans arrived from cities like Atlanta, Birmingham, and Jackson. Some fans had been in Tupelo for days, traveling from places as far as Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. The local police, county sheriffs, and even the National Guard were called in to manage the crowds, but the fans were so enthusiastic that they overwhelmed them. Elvis's performance was a huge success, and before he left, he signed a $10,000 check and gave it back to the town as a gesture of gratitude. After his homecoming, Elvis headed back to Hollywood to continue filming his first movie, Love Me Tender. The film, originally titled The Reno Brothers, was a Civil War story with a twist. Elvis's character stays behind to care for his mother, while his brothers go off to fight in the war. When one of his brothers, played by Richard Egan, is reported dead, Elvis marries the brother's fiancée, Deborah Paget. But then Egan returns, and Elvis's character tragically dies. The film ends with Elvis's face superimposed against the sky, singing the title song, which became a hit on its own. The producer of Love Me Tender, David Weisbart, had previously worked on James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause. On Elvis's first day on set, they talked about whether Elvis might be right for the lead role in a potential James Dean biopic. Elvis also became friends with Dennis Hopper, Nick Adams, and Natalie Wood, who had grown up in Hollywood. Natalie later recalled how refreshing it was to meet someone her age who asked her why she wore makeup and why she wanted to be on her own. It was like having the date she never had in high school. Elvis enjoyed his time in Hollywood, surrounded by his friends and the attention of the media. He was playful and charismatic, often joking with journalists. One writer, Patricia Vernon, described how Elvis playfully tried to keep her from leaving by catching her foot. When she asked him about the girls who threw themselves at him, he said, "I usually take them," but then admitted he was just teasing her because she was so smart. Around this time, Elvis received news that he might be drafted into the Army. His draft board in Memphis had sent him a questionnaire to update his status, but there was nothing to worry about. However, a false story in Billboard magazine claimed that Elvis was going into the Army's Special Services and would be allowed to continue his career. The story was completely inaccurate, but it led to a song called Leave My Sideburns Be, which was one of many songs inspired by Elvis's success. Fans and other artists were creating songs about Elvis, some satirical and others adoring. Humorist Stan Freberg had a hit with his parody of Heartbreak Hotel, while other songs like My Boy, Elvis, and Dear Elvis celebrated him. These songs often used the same rockabilly beat that Elvis had popularized, but few became major hits. Elvis's second album, titled simply Elvis Presley, was released in October and quickly reached #1. The album included a mix of songs, from Big Boy Crudup's So Glad You're Mine to Little Richard's Long Tall Sally. It was clear that Elvis was paying homage to his musical roots while continuing to push the boundaries of popular music. However, not everyone was a fan. On October 18th, Elvis got into a fight at a gas station in Memphis. He had asked the station manager, Ed Hopper, to check his car for leaks, but a crowd gathered, causing traffic to block. Hopper asked Elvis to leave, and a physical altercation ensued. Elvis ended up hitting Hopper, who was taken to the hospital with injuries. In court, Elvis claimed that Hopper had swung at him first and even pulled a knife. The judge fined Hopper and lectured him about not taking the law into his own hands. Elvis later tried to help Hopper, asking the gas station owner not to fire him, but the owner was concerned about the negative impact on business. Another incident occurred on November 23rd in Toledo, Ohio, where a man named Louis John Balint tried to punch Elvis. Balint claimed he was upset because his wife had a picture of Elvis in her wallet instead of a picture of him. Balint was fined and briefly went to jail, but he later said the whole thing was staged. These incidents were just part of the chaos that followed Elvis wherever he went. Despite the challenges, Elvis remained a dominant force in music and entertainment. He returned to New York for his second appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, where he seemed more relaxed and in control. He brought along some friends, including Nick Adams, and they attended the show's rehearsal and live broadcast. Elvis also unveiled a massive poster of himself on the marquee of the Paramount Theater in Times Square, where Love Me Tender would premiere in a few weeks. At a press conference, Elvis spoke about his connection to his fans, saying, "Teenagers are my life and triumph. I'd be nowhere without them." He expressed a desire to talk to the parents who criticized him, believing he could change their minds. Elvis was becoming more than just a performer. He was a cultural icon, and his influence was only growing stronger. Elvis read his Bible, and he believed what it said. He knew that if he sowed evil, evil would come back to him. He didn't think he was bad for people, and if he did, he would go back to driving a truck. He meant it. When Elvis returned to Memphis, he was joined by the actress Natalie Wood, and the newspapers called it a motorcycle romance. Everywhere Elvis went, newsmen followed, hungry for the latest gossip. When Elvis bought a new motorcycle on October 31st, the United Press knew about it. When he took Natalie for a 3-hour ride that night, they knew about it too. The next day, Elvis's friend Nick Adams joined them on a second bike, and the Nashville Tennessean ran the headline, "Natalie's jeans grip tight as cycle romance deepens." Elvis's fame made it hard for him to go out. His friend Neil Matthews said, the only time he could get out was at night, if he had the night off. He'd rent a skating rink or a movie house for the whole night and skate or watch movies until they dropped. Or he'd play golf or tennis, but if he did, everyone in the neighborhood would show up. He couldn't be a person like anyone else. It's bound to have an effect. Elvis was paid well for this loss of privacy. He had sold over 10 million singles for RCA, earning about $450,000 in royalties. This was 2/3 of the label's singles business. When the Colonel announced a new contract, promising Elvis $1,000 a month for 20 years, Variety declared him a millionaire based on record sales, movie income, song publishing, and live and television appearances. It was a feat no one had ever seen before in the entertainment business. Love Me Tender, Elvis's first movie, was a big deal. Usually, only 200 to 300 prints of a film were released. But for Love Me Tender, 550 prints were made, so it could open in nearly double the usual number of theaters. In New York, they called out 35 cops, hired 20 extra ushers, and notified the city's truancy department when 3,000 teenagers lined up outside the Paramount Theater. By 8, the first 2,000 in line got their choice of an Elvis Presley scarf, hat, lapel button, or charm bracelet. In New Orleans, a girl sat through 42 showings of the film, just as she had done with the previous week's movie, to see Elvis in the previews. Within 3 weeks, the $1 million invested in the movie were recovered. No Hollywood film had ever recouped its costs so quickly. The critics, however, weren't as enthusiastic. The New York Times said Elvis was enthusiastic, but used words like turgid and juicy to describe his acting. The Los Angeles Times said, "He pales by comparison when pitted against the resonant inflections of Egan, of course, but who came to watch Elvis act." Time magazine's review was even harsher, calling Elvis a sausage and a Walt Disney goldfish with a limp and white face. The critics made it hard for Elvis, who wanted to be a good actor and had memorized the entire script before filming began. Elvis's Christmas cards that year were sent to film critics, disc jockeys, and fans all over the country. The card said, "To wish you all a cool Yule and a frantic first and a billion thanks to everyone." It was signed, Elvis in big letters and the Colonel in smaller letters. Elvis started work on his second movie, Loving You, during the holiday season. This was Hal Wallis' first film with Elvis, and it was based on Elvis's own rags to riches story. Elvis played Deke Rivers, a small-town boy who became an overnight sensation. The movie had 7 songs, enough to fill up one side of Elvis's first album for 1957. The songwriters were asked to submit songs for the movie on speculation, which was unusual. They sent the songs to Elvis in the form of demo records, and he would choose which ones to include in the film and on the album. The songwriters didn't mind the unusual arrangements because they knew if Elvis recorded a song, it would sell a lot more than if it was just used in a movie. However, they had to share their royalties with Elvis and the Colonel, and sometimes Elvis was given partial writer's credit, even if he didn't write the song. For example, in Love Me Tender, the songs were credited to Vera Mattson and Elvis Presley, even though they were written by Vera's husband, Ken Darby. Elvis was listed as a co-author at the Colonel's suggestion. Elvis's friends said he didn't know about these practices, and that when he found out, he ordered them to stop. Hill and Range, Elvis's music company, was also buying other music publishing companies to add to Elvis's growing music empire. One of the first was American Music, which had big country hits like Smoke, Smoke, Smoke That Cigarette, and 16 Tons. These songs were included in many later albums, and when the records sold, Elvis got a share of the royalties. During a long Christmas holiday in Memphis, Elvis visited the Sun Studio, where he found Sam Phillips working with Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis. They started singing, and Sam recorded the impromptu jam session. Johnny Cash and his wife joined in later, and the session became known as the $1 Million Quartet. Sam didn't admit to recording it, and it took years for the tapes to be released. On January 4th, 1957, 4 days before his 22nd birthday, Elvis went to Kennedy Veterans Hospital in Memphis for his pre-induction physical. He was the only potential recruit that day, and the Army had to chase away photographers who were trying to take pictures of him. A few hours later, Elvis and his friends headed to New York for his third and final appearance on Ed Sullivan's show. The streets around the theater were blocked off for 7 or 8 blocks, and 5,000 kids were screaming. They used a decoy to get Elvis inside. He appeared in a gold lame vest and a velvet shirt, and he introduced a religious song called Peace in the Valley. It was his last television appearance for more than 3 years. The following week, on Elvis's birthday, the Army recruiters in Memphis held a press conference. Captain Elwyn P. Rowan said Elvis was in perfect physical condition, the best possible rating. When it came to his mental score, Captain Rowan said it was average, but couldn't give the exact number. Rumors started flying that Elvis might get special treatment if he joined the Army. Some people said he might not have to get his famous hair and sideburns cut. The Associated Press even wrote a story about it, saying that Elvis might join the Special Services branch and entertain the troops, but not everyone was happy about this idea. Some veterans in Miami wrote angry letters to their senator, George Smathers, who then asked the Pentagon to investigate. The Pentagon said that any comments made were just off the cuff and didn't represent the official Army stance. They also added that if Elvis was drafted, he would have to follow the same rules as everyone else, including the military haircut. Meanwhile, RCA Records released a new Elvis song called Too Much. It quickly became a hit, just like his other songs. Elvis then headed to Hollywood to start filming his second movie. He arrived a few days early and spent his first weekend in the recording studio. RCA needed new songs, so Elvis recorded 4 religious hymns, including Peace in the Valley and Precious Lord, Take My Hand. He also recorded some other songs, like That's When Your Heartaches Begin and All Shook Up. On his first day at the movie set, Elvis got his hair dyed dark. He believed that actors with dark hair had longer careers. The movie, originally called Lonesome Cowboy, was renamed Loving You. It was directed by Hal Cantor, who had visited Elvis in Memphis during the holidays. The movie featured Elvis as a gas station attendant who becomes a country music star, thanks to a publicist played by Elizabeth Scott. The movie had some good songs, including the title track and Teddy Bear. Elvis's parents and some friends flew in from Memphis to watch him film the last scene. They appeared in the audience while Elvis sang Got a Lot o' Livin' to Do. It was a special moment for him. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, announced that Elvis would be making his third movie, Jailhouse Rock, which would be filmed at MGM Studios. Elvis's new contract was a big deal, paying him $250,000 plus 50% of the profits, which was a lot of money for someone who had only starred in one movie. All Shook Up became a huge hit, selling 1 million copies and becoming part of the teenage vocabulary. The Colonel usually went on Elvis's tours. He enjoyed them because it reminded him of his carnival days. He would sell pictures of Elvis and mix with the crowd. One time, he ordered 5,000 pictures from a seller named Mo Weisel, who said the Colonel was a tough negotiator. At a concert, the Colonel sold the pictures for 50 cents each, even though Elvis was already a big star. Inside the concert, the real show was often the audience. 30,000 people would scream and holler, and Elvis would do things like wiggle his finger or burp, which would make them go wild. Sometimes the audience would break through police lines, and Elvis and his band would have to run for their lives. Elvis never did curtain calls, because the fans would try to reach him. The Colonel had a tailor make Elvis a $2,500 gold lame suit, which Elvis wore on tour. But he soon got tired of it, and started thinking about a new home. He bought a big southern mansion called Graceland, which had a long parlor and was on a large piece of land. It cost him $102,500, and he started remodeling it right away. On May 1st, Elvis went to MGM Studios to start recording songs for Jailhouse Rock. He started the day by playing spirituals on the piano, which was his first love. But the studio didn't like this, and told the Jordanaires not to join in. When Elvis noticed they weren't singing, he got upset and walked out. The next day, he came back, and everything went smoothly. Jailhouse Rock had a cliched plot, but it had some good moments. Elvis showed he could act a bit better and dance more confidently. He worked with a dancer named Russ Tamblyn, who taught him new moves. Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, who had written Hound Dog, also worked with Elvis and wrote some great songs for the movie, including the title track and You're So Square Baby, I Don't Care. During filming, Elvis accidentally swallowed a porcelain cap from one of his front teeth. It got stuck in his lung, and he had to go to the hospital. After a couple of days of rest, he was back on set. In June, RCA released a single with 2 songs from Loving You and Teddy Bear. Both songs were big hits, and the movie did well when it came out. Critics were surprised by Elvis's performance, even with the screaming fans in the audience. Despite the challenges, Loving You showed that Elvis was more than just a rock and roll sensation. He was becoming a movie star. Elvis's life was a whirlwind of fame, fun, and the occasional heartache. After finishing the movie Jailhouse Rock, he took a well-deserved 3-week vacation in July. Part of his break included overseeing the renovations at Graceland, his beloved home. He wanted to make it even more special, adding a swimming pool and transforming his bedroom into a dark blue sanctuary with a giant mirror on one wall. He also planned to decorate the entrance hall with a painted sky, complete with clouds for the day and blinking lights for the stars at night. The living room, dining room, and sunroom were to have purple walls with gold trim, and the entire house would glow with soft blue lights at night, making it look like a magical birthday cake. Elvis's vacations weren't just about relaxing, though. He loved sharing his good fortune with his friends. They'd rent roller rinks and play football on skates, or they'd take over the local amusement park, riding the bumper cars which they called Dodge M's until they were worn out. Elvis made sure everyone had a great time, providing free food and rides for all. He never turned anyone away, even if they were strangers who just wanted to join in the fun. Despite his generosity, Elvis's fame brought challenges. Fans were always around, whether he was at home in a hotel or at a studio. Once, when he tried to take a girl to the movies in Memphis, fans spotted his Cadillac, jumped on the hood, and wrote messages on the car with lipstick. The same enthusiasm followed him to the Pacific Northwest, where he performed in Vancouver, British Columbia. The crowd was so wild that Elvis had to stop a show midway and flee for safety. The stage and instruments were overturned, and it took hours for the band to escape. Elvis's return to Tupelo, Mississippi, for the Mississippi and Alabama Fair and Dairy Show, was a big deal. The city planned to build a youth recreation center in his honor, complete with a swimming pool and community building. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Some of his old friends, like disc jockey Dewey Phillips and backup musicians Scotty Moore and Bill Black, were drifting away. Dewey had played a test pressing of Teddy Bear on the air without permission, and Scotty and Bill quit. saying they weren't being paid enough. Elvis was hurt, but eventually took them back on a per diem basis, though things were never the same. The criticism of rock and roll continued, with Frank Sinatra calling it phony and false. Elvis responded politely, saying, "I admire the man, but he's mistaken. This is a trend, just like he faced when he started years ago." Despite the backlash, Elvis's music and movies were more popular than ever. Jailhouse Rock and Teddy Bear were hits, and his album Loving You was #1 in sales. Elvis's entourage now included George Cline and Alan Fortes, two close friends from Memphis. George, a former classmate, was tasked with looking after Elvis on the road, and Alan, a former football player, became a regular at Graceland. They both respected Elvis's mother, Gladys, and made sure the house remained a peaceful haven. Elvis had a strict rule: no swearing, especially not in the Lord's name. In October, it seemed that Elvis might avoid the draft for another year. But on December 20th, the draft board chairman, Milton Bowers, delivered the news in person at Graceland. Elvis was going to be drafted into the Army. Despite offers from the Navy to form an Elvis Presley company, Elvis decided to take his chances with the draft, saying he wanted to serve his country like any other young man. The news was a shock, but Elvis faced it with his usual grace and determination. After all the hype and media frenzy, the day finally arrived for Elvis to report to the Memphis Draft Board office on January 20th, 1958. But by then, the fuss had died down a bit. Most of the uproar happened a year earlier when there were rumors about Elvis not getting a haircut. Now even Elvis seemed calm about it. He told reporters that he would miss his parents, but was proud to serve his country. He packed a razor, a toothbrush, toothpaste, a comb, and enough money to last him 2 weeks, just as the induction notice said. However, things weren't as simple for the people around him. Paramount Pictures and producer Hal Wallis were in a panic. Elvis was supposed to start filming his next movie the same week. He was supposed to join the Army. They had already spent a lot of money on the project, between $300,000 and $350,000, and losing it all was a big deal. Frank Freeman, the studio's production chief, wrote a letter to the draft board asking for an 8-week delay. But the draft board said the request had to come from Elvis himself. So on Christmas Eve, Elvis wrote his own letter. He explained that he was asking for the delay not for himself, but for the studio. He said Paramount had helped him a lot at the start of his career, and he felt it was only fair to return the favor. He ended the letter with a Merry Christmas wish. The draft board met on December 27th and decided to give Elvis a 60-day deferment, pushing his induction back to March 20th. Elvis was grateful, especially for the studio's sake, and the Colonel, his manager, called it very kind. But not everyone was happy. Draft board members, Milton Bowers and his colleagues, became some of the most hated men in America. Fans of Elvis were upset that he was being drafted at all, while those who didn't like him were angry about the deferment. Bowers, a respected civic leader and former state legislator, said he expected some criticism, but was overwhelmed by the backlash. He joked that he talked about Elvis more than he slept, and pointed out that they had drafted people more important than Elvis. After all, what was Elvis without his music? Just a truck driver. Meanwhile, Elvis's Christmas album, released in mid-November, was a huge hit. It topped the charts, and the album included a mix of holiday classics and sacred songs, but it also sparked controversy. Some radio stations, especially in Los Angeles and Portland, banned the album, calling it in bad taste. Even in Canada, most stations refused to play it. However, when a disc jockey in Kingston, Ontario, played the album and asked for listener opinions, 93% of the callers, including several clergymen, loved it. In late December, RCA Victor released another single, Don't, which was another Labor and Stoller song. It was so popular that advance orders topped 1 million. Elvis returned to Hollywood in January to start filming King Creole. He brought along a big group, including his new friend Alan Fortes. They traveled by train, and fans lined the tracks all across America. When they arrived in New Orleans, the city declared it Elvis Presley Day and let the kids out of school. The streets were packed, and security was a nightmare. Elvis even had to leave the set through a back door and escape on a motorboat to avoid the crowd. After finishing the film, Elvis returned to Hollywood to make sure everything was perfect. He then headed back to Memphis. He had only 10 days at home before his induction. He spent most of the time with his friends, going to the skating rink and watching movies. On his last night, he stayed up all night at Graceland, saying goodbye to everyone. On the cold, rainy morning of March 24th, Elvis arrived at the draft board with his parents, a few friends, and the Colonel. Dozens of reporters and photographers were waiting. Elvis was cheerful and made jokes, even though he looked a bit sleepy. He went through the routine medical exams and paperwork, and by the end of the day, he was officially sworn in as a U.S. Army private, with the serial number US 53,310,761. He boarded a bus for Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, where his Army life began. The media and the public were divided about what Elvis's Army service meant for his career. Some thought it would be the end of his reign as a music icon. He would earn a fraction of his usual income and wouldn't be able to make movies or perform concerts, but the Colonel was optimistic. He pointed out that Elvis's music and merchandise would keep selling, and his new status as a soldier might even boost his popularity. There were already new songs and products capitalizing on Elvis's Army stint, like Dear 53,310,761 and Elvis Presley dog tags. The Colonel licensed these products and made a good profit. Elvis's induction was a big deal, but it was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Elvis Presley's first few days in the Army were nothing short of chaotic. The morning of March 25, 1958, started early. Private Presley was already awake and making his bed when the sergeant flipped on the lights at 5:30 a.m. He and the other recruits had arrived at Fort Chaffee late the previous night, and Elvis had barely gotten any sleep. But despite the exhaustion, he was greeted by a crowd of at least 300 girls as the bus drove past the camp entrance. Breakfast was a madhouse. Elvis and the other new recruits marched to the mess hall, where Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, was already waiting. The Colonel, using his honorary title to pull rank, insisted that the reporters and photographers could take all the pictures they wanted. The scene was a frenzy, with more than 55 journalists and photographers swarming around Elvis, outnumbering the recruits. They captured every moment, from Elvis eating his eggs and sausage to chewing his toast and sipping his coffee. Captain Arlie Metheny, the Post Public Information Officer, stood by, perhaps remembering his earlier experience handling the press during the Little Rock integration crisis. After breakfast, Elvis and the other inductees were marched off for 5 hours of aptitude testing. The results would determine their future assignments, and whether they could qualify for officers' candidate school. Elvis didn't take the officer's exam, admitting that he wasn't good at arithmetic. As he passed a barracks, some soldiers called out to him, but Elvis seemed unfazed. When asked by a fellow recruit if the attention bothered him, Elvis replied, "I figure I better start worrying when they don't bother me anymore." The day continued with more chaos. At lunch, Captain Metheny had to step in again to give Elvis a 5-minute reprieve from the photographers. After lunch, the rookies and newsmen headed to the Post Theater, where the chaplain welcomed them. The main event of the day was the haircut. Elvis had already had his hair trimmed twice, but the Army wasn't satisfied. Barber James Peterson, with a crowd of photographers watching, carefully cut Elvis's sideburns and leveled the top of his head. Elvis caught some of his hair and blew it toward the cameras, saying, "Hair today, gone tomorrow," with a wooden grin. Elvis paid 65 cents for the haircut and called his parents from a telephone booth, having not spoken to them all day. The Colonel explained how much Elvis's hair was worth, mentioning the thousands of letters from fans wanting a piece of it. The next day, Wednesday, was just as busy. Elvis received his uniforms and gear, including a pair of size 12 combat boots. He thanked everyone, even the lower ranks, with a polite, "Thank you, sir." The Colonel tried to sneak a southern string tie into Elvis's pile of clothing, but it was clear that the Army had its own rules. A press conference was called, and the general announced that Elvis would be going to Fort Hood in Texas for basic combat training. Elvis had been vaccinated just before the announcement, and was rushed from the infirmary to the press conference. When asked about his assignment, he said he was happy and mentioned his love for Texas. He also spoke positively about his barracks buddies, saying they treated him like anyone else. On Friday, March 28th, Elvis and 18 other privates boarded a bus at dawn for the 425-mile trip to Fort Hood. The Army didn't release the bus's stops for security reasons, but the press was still following the story closely. Lieutenant Colonel Marjorie Shelton, the public information officer at Fort Hood, was caught off guard by the news of Elvis's arrival. She quickly called a press conference, announcing that there would be no more interviews or picture-taking during Elvis's training. Elvis arrived at 4:34 p.m. and was assigned to a company, 2nd Medium Tank Battalion, 2nd Armored Division. The press was thanked and asked to leave, but the job of managing the attention was far from over. Elvis received 2,000 fan letters in his first week at Fort Hood, and the colonel had to ensure each one received a personal response. Despite the challenges, Elvis was an exemplary recruit. He took his training seriously, working hard to avoid any show of impatience. The removal of the press helped, but he still had to deal with fans and the good-natured ribbing from his fellow soldiers. He went through the standard indoctrination program and basic instruction in equipment maintenance and small arms. When he failed to qualify on the pistol range, he signed up for additional instruction during his off-duty time. Outside the Army, Elvis's popularity continued to grow. Congressman as Herlong from Florida invited Elvis to appear at a celebration, but the Army rejected the invitation, stating that Elvis was undergoing initial training. The Army also made it clear that Elvis would not be part of the Special Services branch, despite earlier talks. Colonel Parker's decision to keep Elvis in regular training, rather than allowing him to perform, served both Elvis's and the colonel's purposes. It helped Elvis gain adult acceptance and maintain his image as a hardworking soldier. Elvis found some comfort from his instructors, like Sergeant Bill Norwood, who allowed him to visit his home when he was feeling homesick. Norwood told Elvis to let it all out at his house, but act strong when he returned to the base. Elvis also found a home away from home with Eddie Faddle and his family in Waco, Texas. At the end of his 8 weeks in boot camp, the Army announced that Elvis would get a 2-week leave before returning to Fort Hood for another 14 weeks of training. In September, he and 1,400 other soldiers would be sent to the 3rd Armored Division in Germany. Even though Elvis wasn't on public display, his popularity only increased. The Phil Silvers Show did a burlesque of his Army experience, and RCA released more records, including Elvis Golden Records and his 22nd single, Wear My Ring Around Your Neck, backed by Don't Ya Think It's Time. King Creole also opened just in time for Elvis to attend a preview with his parents during his leave. Elvis's world was spinning. His mother, Gladys, had been sick for a while, and it was hard for her to do the things she loved. She couldn't walk easily, and her usual bright spirits seemed to fade. Elvis and his father, Vernon, decided it was best for her to go back to Memphis, where she could be close to her family doctor. They thought it might help her get better. On a Friday in August, Elvis drove his mother to the train station, and she headed back to Memphis. But the doctors there found out she had a serious liver infection called hepatitis. They put her in a private room at Methodist Hospital, one of the best in the city. 3 days later, the doctors called Elvis, telling him to come home as soon as he could. Elvis was on a military base in Texas, but he got emergency leave and rushed to Memphis. When he arrived, he went straight to his mother's bedside. Her condition was serious, but seeing Elvis seemed to lift her spirits. Despite this, her health didn't improve. Elvis and Vernon took turns sitting with her, and sometimes Elvis's friends were there to support him. On Thursday, August 14th, Vernon was with Gladys when she started having trouble breathing. She passed away, and Vernon called Elvis to tell him the news. Gladys was only 46, and her death was a devastating blow to Elvis. He wanted to hold a service at Graceland, but security was a concern, so they had a family viewing at home and the service at a funeral home. The Blackwood Brothers, a gospel group Gladys loved, came to sing. Thousands of fans came to pay their respects, and the service was filled with grief and love. After the service, Elvis was given a few more days off to be with his family. Fans sent over 100,000 cards, letters, and telegrams, all offering their condolences. On August 24th, Elvis flew to Dallas, telling reporters that his father would be going with him to Germany. He said, "One of the last things Mom said was that Dad and I should always be together. I'll report back to Fort Hood in the morning. Wherever they send me, Dad will go to." The next few weeks were a blur of training and preparation. On September 19th, Elvis and his unit left for Europe. The train stopped in Memphis, where Elvis said goodbye to a group of fans who had rushed to see him. Then it was off to New York, where he faced a sea of reporters and photographers. They asked him about his plans, his fans, and his mother. Elvis was honest and open, sharing that he missed his mom deeply, and that she had been more than just a mother to him. As Elvis boarded the troopship USS Randall, the world watched. He was heading to a new chapter, but the love and support of his fans and family would be with him every step of the way. Despite the loss and the challenges ahead, Elvis was determined to keep going, just as his mother would have wanted.